Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining the webinar. This is Heather Creven from Wastecap, Nebraska, and we are going to go ahead and get started. This is our last webinar in the Business and Community Roadmap Series to Zero Waste. Wastecap, Nebraska has 4 webinars related to businesses and 4 webinars related to communities in 2016. The U.S. Zero Waste Business Council presented for the business webinars and EcoCycle for the community webinars. To view the previous webinars, go to www.wastecapne.org and select the archives. All of these webinars are funded by a grant from the Nebraska Department of Environmental Quality. For those of you who may not be familiar with Wastecap Nebraska, we are a statewide, member-based nonprofit that works with community and business leaders to build zero waste communities. Our mission is to eliminate waste in Nebraska through innovation, education, and policy change. This webinar will focus on Composting 101 and 5 strategies for success in Nebraska. You will learn what composting is and why it matters. Composting has great potential to stimulate rural economies, protect our food supply, conserve water, invest in healthy soils, and reduce waste. And the news keeps getting better. Nebraska is already well positioned to reap all of these benefits. Hear about the exciting projects taking root throughout the state and explore the opportunities and challenges in treating a program. Kate Bailey is the program manager for EcoCycle Solutions. Kate is a leading authority on zero waste best practices and focuses on the facts, numbers, details, and logistics that help zero waste initiatives succeed. Over the past decade, she has created national reports, websites, webinars, and tools to empower local communities to implement zero waste solutions. Adam Seegart is the founder of We Compost, a small but growing compost company in Omaha, Nebraska. We Compost is an urban compost pickup service that allows residents and small businesses in Omaha to recycle organic and compostable materials at their home or work. Adam has a master's in urban and regional planning from the University of Illinois. During the webinar, please type your questions into the chat box as they come to mind, and there will be a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. A recording of this presentation will be available afterwards on our website in our archives at www.wastecapne.org. Thank you again for attending this webinar, and as I turn the presentation over to Kate, there will be a slight delay before she begins.
Great. Thanks so much, Heather, for kicking us off and having us back for this 4th in the series of webinars. Great to connect with Wastecap on all of these, and very excited to talk about composting this morning with everyone. So, good morning. I've actually been thinking a lot about composting at this time of year as the leaves are falling and I'm putting them into my garden beds and I'm putting those beds to sleep and thinking about restoring the soil and what we're going to grow next year. So I think people often think about the spring as the best time to talk about composting, but I think fall is an important time, and I think Adam will agree with me, my co-presenter, that really any time is a good time to talk about composting. So let's go ahead and get started. I just want to give you a brief background on EcoCycle and who we are. We are one of the oldest and largest nonprofit recyclers in the U.S. We are based out of Boulder, Colorado, and we have been in the business for 40 years now. We run infrastructure, trucks, provide education to schools, to businesses, to residents. We offer a variety of services. We advocate for policies and programs to really have our hands in all aspects of recycling and zero waste. And that's really led us to composting. We've been actively in composting for more than a decade. We started offering, providing zero waste events, so collecting food scraps from some county fairs or festivals on the weekends to try to introduce people to the concept. We were the first in the region to offer food waste collection from businesses using our fleet of trucks. We've been composting with the kids in the schools for more than 10 years, so a lot of experience teaching kids how to separate materials and why composting matters. We also produce a compost tea soil amendment, which has been helpful in educating people about how to put the nutrients back in our soil, that our soil is actually alive and full of microorganisms. And we've helped launch 5 curbside composting programs in cities throughout our county. So it's really fun to look back and see where we've grown in the last decade, and of course there's so much work that still needs to be done. And there's so much that we can cover with composting. It's such a broad topic, and really any of these aspects of composting, we could spend an entire webinar just on any of these topics. So I wanted to just give you a little bit of a heads up that we're going to, touch briefly on a lot of different topics to really help you feel educated, to feel, well-versed in some of the challenges and the opportunities in composting, but really there's so much more we can delve into. Today we've narrowed it down to the basics about what composting is. Really want to focus on how to sell your program, really how to convince your decision makers that this brings value to your community, that it's important for you to move forward on composting now, as well as looking at the infrastructure, the policies and programs that you'll need to be able to move forward. Adam's going to walk us through some of the awesome stuff happening on the ground in Nebraska, and then we're going to wrap up with a series of recommendations for where you are as a state and as local communities and what might work best in moving forward. So composting, in some ways it doesn't feel like it needs to be explained. I talked about my putting leaves in the garden, and composting is this thing that naturally happens. It's a natural decomposition of materials and nutrients back into the soil. It's a natural process that's happened, since the dawn of time pretty much. So, but when we talk about a composting process or a composting facility, how is that different than what's happening in nature? And I really was thinking about, for us, we're more actively managing the process. So yes, composting is something that happens naturally, but when we're running facilities or programs, we're basically trying to make that process happen a little faster by monitoring the materials that we're putting in, the temperature, the moisture, all with the goal of creating this super valuable, nutrient-rich soil amendment, the dark brown, good-smelling compost that we know really helps restore our soil. So I also think it's important with composting that we recognize it's the microorganisms that are doing the work. So it's not something that just sort of happens. There's a whole, your composting bin, your facility, it's teeming with life, and those microorganisms are what are breaking down the materials, and so those are the things that we need to help them succeed by keeping the optimum temperature and moisture and all those things. So we're really trying to just sort of more actively manage what's already happening in nature. And there's a good deal of materials that can be composted. If we look across the country, it's more of half of what we throw away could end up composted. This is, of course, a lot of our food scraps. You've got our leaves and our grass clippings coming off our lawn, especially this time of year. And you have a lot of what are called soiled paper products. So you have your paper towels, your greasy cardboard pizza boxes, your tissues, your paper plates, some of your compostable food service ware. So there's a big category of these mixed papers that can actually be composted and that are not able to be recycled. And then you have some of your wood products, your leftover dimensional lumber, things that can be easily mulched or worked into a compost bin. So it's a pretty astonishing number, half of what we throw away. And so from a waste reduction and zero waste perspective, compost really is the new horizon and offers us so many great opportunities to reduce our impact and reduce our waste. And sadly, we're just not capturing a lot of these materials. 95% of our food scraps end up in the landfill every year, and 40% of our yard debris. The food number, to me, is just astonishing. Talk a little bit more about food waste as we move forward, but you can see there's so many gains to be made in this area, particularly with food scraps, and still some low-hanging fruit with yard waste as well. We're generally seeing that composting is something new for Americans. They generally don't do it. About 3/4 of Americans do not compost. So it is something that is very new. It's a new behavior. We're going to have to help teach people, not just how to do it, but why to take the time and why it's important. We have to educate our decision makers about why composting matters, because they're also not doing it in many cases. And we need to build off the successes of the people who are doing it and show how it's easy, it's fun, it's interactive, and it really helps people lead a green and more sustainable life. I want to recognize that Nebraska is definitely one step ahead of the game when it comes to composting. You've had a ban on grass clippings, leaves, branches, your typical yard debris materials for, I believe, more than 20 years. You're one of 20 states that banned yard debris in the early 90s, and that really gave rise to a large number of yard waste facilities around the country. So if we look at Nebraska as a state, you have some of that yard waste infrastructure already in place. Colorado, for a lot of us, we're just building the yard waste and the food scrap infrastructure at the same time. As I mentioned, about 20 states came on board with yard waste bans, and what we've seen in the last couple of years is a couple new states come on board with some food waste bans as well, really trying to move businesses to compost more of their food scraps. So that's some exciting new developments happening. So because Nebraska's had this ban on landfilling yard debris for so long, if we look at what's in your trash compared to nationwide, we really see yard debris is not very much. It's only 3% compared to about 8% nationwide. So you're definitely a step ahead of the game there, which is awesome. And what we see as still the big materials left is, of course, the food and also a little bit of the paper. So statewide, food is about 16% of what's remaining in the trash. And Wastecap has done a couple of audits in communities like Alliance, Broken Bow, Hastings, Wayne, and Louisville. And what we're seeing in those communities is the amount of food discarded is even higher. It's more like 21 to 27%. So in many cases, it is the largest percentage of the waste stream that's still remaining. And one reason for that is that there are a lot of barriers for food composting. There's infrastructure in place for your leaves and your grass clippings, but it's not there for the food waste. And there's regulations and siting challenges. There's also the economics of composting compared to landfills, and landfills being relatively cheap in our area of the country. There are, of course, barriers about getting people to change their behavior, and it's the new kid on the block. So there's a lack of training programs, a lack of political will in moving forward, a lack of awareness. So we've got a lot of ground we can cover. The good news is that none of these are insurmountable obstacles for sure. And if you look back at where recycling was 30 years ago, many of these challenges are very similar. So when we think about composting, I think it's really important with any of these issues, we come back to the why. Why are we doing this? Why is it important? There are so many things when we talk to local decision makers about, there's so many things on their plate. There's so many different things going on in your community, choices to be made, and so we really need to talk about why does composting help? Why does composting matter? So I covered several different, not just environmental, but also economic and social benefits of composting that I think don't usually get enough credit. And I'm going to start first with the economics, because this can really be a great way to open the conversation, especially with your elected officials or your public works. They really want to see the dollars and cents behind this. So one of the things about composting is it keeps materials out of the landfill. Well, there's a cost to putting materials in landfill. That's a tipping fee. It's the price we pay per ton to dump materials. And we saw that food scraps are such a large portion of what we throw away that keeping those materials out can actually add up to some significant savings. We recently did a study for the City of Alliance up in the Panhandle, and we saw by extending their recycling program and really expanding it, they could save more than $115,000 a year in avoided costs, money that they would have spent putting those materials in the landfill. And that was a pretty simple calculation of just, tons diverted times the dollar amount of the landfill. It was about $54 a ton in Alliance. So you can see that this is, $115,000, that will catch somebody's attention. So this is a great way to show that composting does have economic value, does have savings to the city, and it's really important to help the city extend that landfill life. So this is a great way to, I think, start the conversation and really get somebody's attention. And important to show that there are financial benefits. Another great benefit is to the local economy. Composting creates 5 times more jobs than landfilling in both collecting, processing, and then using the compost as a soil amendment. We're seeing some tremendous growth in social entrepreneurs like Gainesville Compost here in the picture, or Adam's going to talk about a lot of great programs in Nebraska where folks are just seeing this as a business opportunity, and they're heading out on their bikes or with little trucks, and they're collecting food scraps from residents, from businesses, and they're processing them locally, and those are creating jobs. And one of the great things about composting jobs is they can't be outsourced. They're very much local jobs. So food waste is expensive to transport. It's expensive to ship dirt around, so composting is very much a local process. So those are local jobs that feed back into our local economy. And when we talk about the economy, we can't ignore that Nebraska is an agricultural state. So when we talk about soil sustaining us, feeding us as people, it is also feeding the economy. And so I think it's important to reach out to those partnerships like the Farmers Union or other groups who are concerned about agriculture and its impacts and its sustainability into the future as we try to produce more and more food to feed more and more people. We're seeing that our soils are not being replenished. We're seeing that we're losing topsoil, cropland is being abandoned, it's being overused. It's basically we're pulling nutrients out faster than we're replenishing them. And composting offers us so many opportunities to reinvest in that soil so we don't end up in a situation where we can't pull the food that we need. Composting has lots of benefits to our soil in terms of reducing fertilizer use, promoting higher yields. It helps retain water, prevents erosion, improves drainage. All of these things really make a difference between dirt and soil. And we don't grow things in dirt, we grow things in soil. Soil's alive, it's healthy, and this is what we need, not just to feed ourselves, but to continue the agricultural economy that we depend on. We can also talk about our soil as a climate solution. In fact, when we put compost down in our soil, it stores carbon. We're basically taking carbon out of the atmosphere and burying it into that soil. Soil, in fact, stores twice as much carbon as plants, which means when people say you should plant a tree to help climate change, really we should be putting compost down. Yes, we can plant the tree too, but it's so much more important that we put compost in the soil that we're planting that tree in, because that's really helping pull carbon down out of the atmosphere. There's a great study and project out of Marin County, California that I think has great potential for Nebraska. They found that if they were able to apply just a ½ an inch of compost to 5% of California's open range lands, that they would reduce greenhouse gases the equivalent of taking 6 million cars off the road for a year. That's an incredible reduction in greenhouse gas emissions based on a relatively simple solution. So they're just putting compost.
Kate, it sounds like we lost you. Are you still there? Kate? Sorry, everyone. Apparently, Kate's having some technical difficulties. She said they were having some issues with their phone line. Hopefully, she will be back on in just a couple minutes.
Total emissions coming out of their landfill gas. And so when people say, well, it's okay that we bury our food scraps because we're getting the gas off the landfill, that's not the case. We're not getting all of the gas, and the gas that is escaping is incredibly powerful. So we really need to promote composting programs rather than just these stopgap measures to collect landfill gas. And I'll conclude with this last reason why we should promote composting, and that's that Americans want it. We have seen that Americans, while they are not composting, they do understand the importance. They do say that they are willing to compost, and they're also willing to use gardening products in their gardens, on their homes, in their neighborhoods. So it's very much a value that appeals to them. It's part of a green, healthy lifestyle. It's building those local jobs, that local economy. So we do have public support as we move forward, and that's huge because that will show that composting is popular, that people want it, and that really helps your elected officials decide to invest in these types of programs. So when we talk about investing in these programs, what do we mean? What do we need to do in terms of the infrastructure, the policies moving forward? We are definitely seeing that there's a lot of growth in composting programs around the country. In fact, we're seeing exponential growth over the last decade, with more than 200 communities now have food scrap composting for their residents. And you just need to pick up a copy of Biocycle magazine or any sustainable news to really see that there are programs and services for all sectors of the community: businesses, schools, residents, governments, composting programs. About
Kate, are you still there?
Yep. Did you lose me there?
It's kind of cutting out on me.
Okay. Yeah, I see my internet connection was a little spotty. You want me to back up a slide or two?
That would be fine.
Okay. Sorry about that. I just want to say that composting are really exponentially growing across the country. We're seeing in the last decade, it's grown to more than 200 programs around the country that are collecting food scraps from residents. You can find, if there's a program in your area, at Find a Composter. And there are stories every week about businesses, schools, residents, governments, events, new programs popping up around the country to introduce people to composting at all levels. But our infrastructure is lagging behind. There are more than 5,000 composting facilities in the U.S., but you can see the majority of them are only set up to handle your leaves, your branches, your grass clippings. Only 7% of our facilities are set up to handle food scraps. So this is really where we need to expand. And one of the things that's interesting about Nebraska is that most of these composting facilities, these yard waste facilities in Nebraska, are publicly owned. So this is very much a decision to have with your public works department, with your local officials. These are publicly managed facilities, and so the cities and the counties are making the decisions about if and when to invest in food scrap composting. And when we think about these facilities, we think about large regional facilities that process a lot of materials, typically far away from the urban areas. And what does it take to move these yard waste facilities over to handle food scraps? How is food scraps different? And it turns out that food scraps are a lot more complicated to compost than yard debris. In a lot of cases, a lot of us have a pile of leaves in the backyard with some branches and some grass clippings, and you can just kind of leave it there for a while, and it eventually breaks down, and it doesn't really smell, and nothing really happens. It just sort of does its thing for a while. Food scraps are not the same. They require a lot more active management. There's, of course, odor issues. If you let that pile of food just sit, you don't mix it, you don't have the right balance of materials and nutrients, it's going to smell, and it's definitely going to attract some vermin and some pests. There are also issues about the high nitrogen content in food. So when it rains or there's storm water, it can wash a lot of nitrogen into our waterways, which leads to algal blooms and the wrong nutrient levels. So we have to manage the water that's both produced on site and that flows through the site for a food scrap composting facility. So there's a lot more regulation and management of these facilities, and with that comes some increased cost when we think about just managing our yard waste instead. And this is why we've seen, a slower transition to food scrap composting. It is honestly more complicated from a processor perspective. And these facilities are regulated state by state, so I'm hoping that Adam can talk a little bit about the Nebraska regulations on this. But one of the great things about composting infrastructure is we don't have to just have these large centralized facilities. Really, all sizes are welcome, and there's huge opportunity in a lot of decentralized, community-based systems of all different sizes. So we're talking about anything from a community garden to a church property to a community college that's managing its materials on site. There's small anaerobic digesters that can produce a little bit of biogas for energy production. There's a wide range of opportunity here, and really the solution is not one or the other, but both and. All of these applications plus the large-scale facilities are really what's going to help us make a dent in that huge amount of food waste that we're throwing away. And there are a lot of benefits to community-based composting. I mentioned the product stays local. Well, community-based composting, it stays super local, even within your own neighborhood. And that offers a lot of opportunity for engagement. So it's not just something people throw in their bin and it goes away and they don't know what happens. They're much more engaged in the process. They have a greater sense of ownership. They're much more connected to the outcome. They're much more likely to use those materials in their neighborhood, put the compost back in their own garden. You're also building a more diverse and resilient infrastructure. We've seen some problems with some of these large-scale composting facilities getting shut down because of odor, because of transportation issues, and so you really need a network of options. You need a lot of different possibilities, a lot of different ways for processing all these materials. So there really is great potential for programs of all sizes to fill the gap. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Adam, who's going to talk through some of the great community scale programs happening in Nebraska right now. And Adam, just let me know when you're ready and I'll advance the slides for you.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
You sound good.
Great. So my name's Adam Segert. I founded We Compost here in Omaha, Nebraska about 3 years ago. And I can tell you from experience that in that time, I have seen composting become a much greater activity here in the state, a much more feasible program for businesses and residences to engage in, and we've also had a lot of expansion in infrastructure and entrepreneurs in that space. And so I'm glad to I'll talk a little bit about myself, of course, and then some of my other cohorts who are helping in this cause. So with no further ado, if we could get the next slide. Yeah, so there's many faces of composting in Nebraska. We've got the waste industry, which mainly acts in our state as a hauler to some of the composting sites. Farmers, lots of farmers are doing on-site composting. Colleges, I know we've worked with you and We Compost and Gretna Sanitation slash Soil Dynamics have worked with UNO the last 2 summers on a pilot program for composting on campus there, as well as there's been some other pilot programs in the state. We'll talk about the entrepreneurs, and there's a myriad of local food producers and projects that are doing composting to produce their own soil and also sort of close the loop, working with restaurants and taking back some of the food waste when they make deliveries. And it's a great thing. We'll talk about one particular example of that. So if we can get the next slide, please. Soil Dynamics, also known as Gretna Sanitation, is a hauler in Gretna and Ashland, Nebraska. And it's ran by the Harpino family. And Andy Harpino was looking to do something with all of the heavy yard waste he was picking up from residences. Didn't want to, there had to be another use for it. Didn't need to go to the dump. So he found a 20-acre site in Ashland. And for those of you who know, it's near the Sac Museum off the Ashland Interstate exit and the Henry Dorley Safari Zoo. Yeah, and from small beginnings, he's got a rather big operation out there. It's he accepts food scraps, has a 1,000 cubic yard limit, I believe. And I work with him to some extent on some of the programs around here. We just launched a composting program with Louisville Public Schools that I'll talk a little bit about in a further slide. But the greatest part about it is they produce a pretty good compost product and other products out there. It's hyper-local, and with the coming demise, or we haven't quite figured out, of Omagro and what's going on in the city of Omaha, it might be the best local product that we have available. And I know that they're looking to expand their capacity to accept food waste here in the future, and hopefully there'll be a bigger alternative to some of the problems we have with infrastructure and composting around here in the city of Omaha. We can get the next slide, please. Now, Prairie Land Dairy is the biggest player in the food waste composting game in the state of Nebraska. They partner with schools and businesses to compost food waste and yard waste to some extent, I think a smaller extent, and they mix it with manure from their cows on site there in Firth, Nebraska. It's a big operation if anyone ever has the chance to visit. I think if my figures are correct, they get things from Lincoln, Omaha, they're accepting food waste from Crete and other surrounding communities. They're taking in 4 million pounds a month right now, and they're producing 10,000 yards of compost a year. So just a quick little math equation there. 4 million pounds of food waste might be about 4,000 cubic yards of compostables, and it looks like they're putting out about 800 cubic yards a month out of that if you divide 10,000 by 12. So you can kind of see food waste, and that's when it gets mixed from with manure from there. So you can see food waste actually reduces in volume quite a bit throughout the composting process. There's not a lot left at the end. It's a lot of water in there, but there's a lot of nutrients too. If we can still go back one slide, please. Yeah, they collect 4 million pounds, produce 10,000. They take compostable plastics, and if you want to work with them, I think they work with a variety of haulers. They don't haul their own waste, like their own compost, like Gretna Sanitation and Soil Dynamics does. So if you contact them, I think they can hook you up with a hauler and maybe get you into the process. Next slide, please. And here's one that's I'm pretty excited about and is kind of near and dear to my heart because of my love of the red wiggler worm. And it's Big Red Worms in Lincoln, Nebraska, ran by Jeremiah Picard, kind of under the auspices of the Nebraska Farmers Union. So it's a nonprofit, I believe, and hopefully don't get corrected on that. But it's a large-scale vermicomposting project, and they use what's called a flow-through vermicomposter. So they have these giant, I think they're 40-foot long by 5-foot wide sort of boxes where they feed from the top, and they harvest the vermicompost as it processes through the bottom by cutting vermicompost off the bottom. If you ever get a chance to Google a flow-through vermicomposting system on YouTube, it's pretty fascinating. So Jeremiah is collecting from Lincoln Public Schools and local businesses, and if my numbers are correct, he's taking about 9 to 12 yards of food waste a week, mixing it with 15 to 20 yards of bedding and manure, and he's pre-composting that thermophilically. And once it has gone off the heat cycle and has began to cool down and got a little stable, he feeds it to the worms, and if my numbers are correct from our conversation the other day, he's feeding them 1,800 pounds twice a week, so 3,600 pounds a week to the worms. Pretty impressive stuff. If we can get the next slide, please. So Big Muddy Urban Farm. Big Muddy is an example of an organization that produces food, works with restaurants in selling hyperlocal food to them, and also accepts scraps from those restaurants and uses it to produce their own soil. They're located on and around 33rd in California in Omaha. For anybody who's familiar, they're behind California Taco is their big campus. They've got a 3-bin compost system right behind there. Some community members also engage and go and dump their food scraps there that I know of. So they have a fairly well-managed pile, move stuff through, and get a good compost product at the end and sort of complete the cycle there. And I know of a lot of other local growers who are doing the same thing. So when they don't waste a trip, they take things back. They deliver the food and they take compostables back with them. If we can get the next slide, please. And here's a great example of community composting that's also near and dear to my heart, and that's Gifford Park Garden here in Omaha, which is also fairly close to 33rd in California. I think it's 35th and Cass Street. It's got a 3-bin composting system, for those of you who know. It receives scraps from residences, so I think there's anywhere from 10 to 20 neighbors who are dumping food scraps in there right now. And that is mixed with the garden waste, so dead plants, grass, wood chips from the chickens, old chicken bedding, and some commercial and food rescue materials. So there's a food rescue organization that sets up shop there, and some of the stuff just isn't good enough for human consumption, so that makes it in the bin. I helped add worms to it, so their second bin, when we flip things over from the first bin after it becomes thermophilic to the second bin, the worms really start digesting that food, those old food scraps, and we're making a pretty rich compost there that's being used by the local gardeners, and I think they have 30 or 40 garden plots there, and it's a wonderful place, an oasis in the city, and I recommend anybody visit it once again. And a great example of how we can get together, manage these systems, and create really good community composting. You can see the next slide, please. And here's Louisville Public Schools. So they just started composting in their cafeteria 1 month ago, and I helped do the audit and training for the first couple of days of the school year for the students and the teachers and cafeteria staff. So Soil Dynamics is working, and Soil Dynamics is the hauler and the receiving site for these scraps in particular. They're collecting pre- and post-consumer scraps at Louisville Public Schools. So working with the cafeteria staff to make sure that things like napkins, vegetable cuttings, etc., are making it in before the meal is served. During the meal, when students are scraping their plates, they are encouraged to throw away things that are disposable. Everything that we can compost is being placed in the bins, the red bin you see in front of you, and any recyclables will go in a blue recycling bin. Using a bag, so this is kind of unique. Gretna Sanitation slash Soil Dynamics just got a cart washer. So they're using a bagless system. And if anybody who knows and has run some of these programs, the bags can be a little expensive, and the compostable bags, and they're not exactly great on the back end either. They can, when they're on the composting site, they can be stuck in equipment. Blow the plastic can become separated from food scraps and kind of blow around the site. So this is kind of an experiment. They're using a bagless system, so the students are dumping it straight into the cart. When those carts are picked up, they have a cart washer that sprays hot sanitizing water into it, and so they get a fresh cart and no compostable bags are being used, so we're saving a little expense there. And then after, so one other thing, any leftovers after the meal are also being composted. And if we could get the next slide. And Lincoln Public Schools, and this is something I just read about, but to my knowledge they're working with both big red worms and prairie land to, that's where the compostables are going from a lot of different schools in their district. I think they're in double digits. They've done some audits, so they saw that schools that are composting are achieving a 52% diversion rate, and before they were only diverting 20%. So if I'm no mathematician, but about a third of their waste from their stream was compostable, which was pretty impressive. Elementary schoolers, especially the young ones, do not eat everything that is served to them, and anyone who has young children knows you cannot predict the hunger level of students at those young ages. So we do see a lot of waste off those trays, but they're doing a great job collecting it, and it's becoming, it's getting a rebirth as compost, and going to grow new food out of it for the next school year. And if we could get another slide. And lastly, my organization, We Compost. I work with commercial and residential generators here in Omaha. So we've got a little milk route where we pick up food scraps and napkins, anything that's compostable from residences here in Omaha. I service some small commercial spots. I work with Soil Dynamics on servicing some larger commercial generators. So we sort of team up, and they handle the hauling, and I sort of handle the internal logistics for the programming. We've got a pretty neat program going at First United Methodist Church here in Omaha, where I think somewhere around 40% or 40 in number of their parishioners are collecting food scraps in 8-gallon bags and bringing them to a collection site. And from there, I'm taking them off-site and handling the composting. So every Sunday when they come to church, they're dropping off their food scraps, and we're filling about 1.5 55-gallon barrels a week with food scraps that would otherwise be thrown away. And I think it's a good thing for them to sort of ensure attendance, because nobody wants to leave those stinky food scraps sitting around too long. And that's something we kind of want to do in the next year here, is work with a lot more churches and maybe some small backyard gardeners and see if they can sort of share any capacity they have or generate capacity on site for their neighbors to use or their parishioners to use. Really like to get some on-site programming, especially those churches that have gardens or neighbors that have gardens. We have a neighbor in a neighborhood who has a large compost bin like I do in my backyard, and I allow some neighbors to come and dump their food scraps into it. I don't see why that can't be replicated, and it has been done with some success in I think New York City and some other cities. Another project I'm working on is vermicomposting, so I'll be rebuilding my giant flow-through system, much like Jeremiah Picard has at Big Red Worms, and I'll be siting that at the site of the Big Garden Network, and that will hopefully be done here by the end of October. And next slide. And with that, I think I'm done, and I'll stick around for questions at the end.
Great. So thanks so much, Adam. That's awesome. I love hearing about, as you call them, the hyper-local solutions going on, and I think it's so important. You're meeting people where they are. They're already coming into church every week. That's a great collection spot. tying in with community gardens at the schools. I mean, there's just so much exciting potential and opportunity, and not just about diverting food scraps. I mean, I think it really is about building communities and neighborhood interaction and a lot of those social benefits that we think of kind of ancillary to the goal of diverting food scraps. So it really are such a crux of the program. So thank you for that recap of what's happening on the ground. And I'm just going to wrap us up with 5 quick recommendations on kind of where to focus. Composting, as we mentioned, is a big topic. So given where things are in Nebraska, what makes most sense in terms of how to move forward? And then Adam and I will be here for questions. And the first recommendation is really going to build on a lot of what Adam said, is we don't need to get stuck on the big picture. We don't have to have this large centralized facility that's handling tens of thousands of pounds of food waste every week. There are a lot of great small-scale programs and interim steps that can really build awareness, that can build engagement, that can build the demand for larger processing facilities. There's so much work that we can do using our existing networks, and there's great benefits to that as well. And I'll give a shout out to the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. They have a great guide to community composting with a lot of similar examples to what's happening in Nebraska from around the country. And they developed this hierarchy based on the EPA hierarchy that really shows, in terms of composting, that those small scale, those backyard on-site programs are really more beneficial than your centralized facility. So again, they really complement each other, and they have a lot of great social benefits as well, which makes them preferable in a lot of ways. So there's great stuff we can be doing there. And it's important that we also think about composting as a supply and a demand. So yes, I have these food scraps that I want to get rid of, so we're giving all this supply to composters, but we also need to be creating the demand for their product. So we talked about soil dynamics, creating a great compost product. The more you buy that product, the more you use it on your yard, your golf courses, your churches. Really, one of the things that's great about compost is anywhere there's dirt is an opportunity to use compost. It doesn't have to be a garden or a vineyard. It can be a street median. It can be transportation remediation projects. I mean, the sky's the limit in terms of where we can use the compost, and really creating that demand and using those products completes the cycle, and it helps build the economic case for more and more people like Adam to get into this market. And I'll call out a couple cities around the country are actually requiring residents to put down composting if they've done any sort of a renovation or new construction. And again, these sort of programs really help drive the demand and help the economics. And the economics can be challenging. In many places, composting is more expensive than landfilling or about the same. But we need to account for those environmental benefits of composting and the environmental costs of landfills and incineration. So we know landfills pollute our groundwater. We know we have to manage the methane that's coming off of them. And we know that composting restores the soil, and it helps protect us against drought and prevents erosion. And so there are some real tangible benefits to composting that have a dollar figure associated to them, and then there are some real negative impacts from landfilling that cost us. And so there's some great tools out there around full cost accounting that can give some numbers to this. So this is a report out of Ontario, Canada, and they showed that composting per ton actually was saving the community money, in some cases $15 a ton when you looked at all those benefits, whereas landfills were costing $50 to $75 per ton. So you could see when we look at all the environmental and economic figures, composting is definitely a win-win. We also, I think, need to keep in mind that composting is not always the best thing to do with our food scraps. We really need to start looking at why are we throwing away so much food. I think many of us have seen these just astonishing numbers across the country and around the world. 40% of U.S. food is wasted. this is an incredible social issue. When 1 in 6 households are food insecure. And so there's a huge amount of gains that can be had both at the household and the business level in terms of reducing food waste to start with. And I've just listed off some of the great resources to help you get started with this. And of course, one of my favorites is the little Eat Me First box that you can throw in your fridge at home or at work. And then lastly, it's a little bit out of the traditional composting sense, but when we looked at what's left in our waste stream, we saw so much of it was still paper. And so when you think about all of the problems of organic materials going into the landfill and creating methane and all these materials that are still being thrown away, there's some really easy gains we could still have in just targeting paper recycling. A lot of that cardboard, newspaper, white paper that we're not capturing from businesses, that doesn't need any additional infrastructure to get started. And then that also introduces the opportunity for us to focus on, introduce those napkins and those paper towels that can be composted. And so I think there's some great opportunities for us to look at in terms of the paper stream as well. And of course, lots of great resources for you to get some help moving forward. The graphic on the right is from the Yard Waste to Food Waste Toolkit from the U.S. Compost Council Foundation. So they've got some great guides about if you have a yard waste collection program, how to transition it to a food scrap program, both in terms of residents and logistics and outreach. BioCycle magazine has some great success stories. I highly recommend picking that up, checking them out online. And then some home composting resources here in Nebraska and also some best practices. So with that, I just want to close thinking about, what do we have to gain? We have healthy people, healthy land, healthy economy. Composting really can help environmentally, economically, and socially. It's an incredible program. There's great stuff happening on the ground in Nebraska, and I have no doubt more great stuff to come over the coming years. So if you need help along the way, we've got a great website, ecocyclesolutionsHub.org. We've got a roadmap to help your community plan for zero waste, best practices, tips and tools on composting, and things like that. So feel free to give us a shout. And thanks, of course, so much for joining us. And I'll turn it over to Heather for questions for myself and Adam.
Great, Kate. Thank you both, Kate and Adam, for the valuable information. I do have some questions from the audience. My first question is, given the rural nature of Nebraska and the growing interest in organic farming and farm-to-table, it seems like there is a great potential to develop a cooperative network of on-farm composting operations that could perhaps share equipment on a regional basis. Is there any models elsewhere in the nation for a cooperative composting system?
That's a great question. I am not sure. I would recommend reaching out to the Institute for Local Self-Reliance. They are based out of Maryland, and they have done, I think, the best report in the country on community-scale composting, so they would be able to connect you with some different programs happening to see what might be able to match up with what you're thinking, and I think you're right. I mean, those partnerships with farm to table and organic farming, yeah, there's so much great potential and momentum around this. I think those are incredible partnerships and absolutely an opportunity to move forward.
And then, Adam, I have a question for you. Is there a network of composters in Nebraska or a way to connect with all of these groups in one place?
The short answer would be no. We do talk, some of us do talk on a pretty regular basis, but there's no formal organization as of right now.
And then, Kate, I believe that when you were talking about the methane is when we lost some audio from you. So I have a couple comments. If you could kind of go back over and talk about the sources for the 20 to 40% methane recovery from landfill gas recovery systems. In Omaha, they have people that are claiming much higher capture rates. So they would like to know the source of reference that you were using when you were discussing the issue of keeping yard waste out of the landfill so that they can speak about that with key officials.
Sure, that's a great question. And I apologize, it looked like I did not source that slide. So definitely feel free to send me an email and I can give you some specific sources. All these numbers that I use are coming from the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. So they are the seminal organization and overseeing things on a global level. One of the challenges with landfills is these landfill gas systems are relatively new, so we have a good sense of what might be happening at the current time. We don't know what's going to happen down the road. So what we see is that landfills are claiming anywhere between 75 and 95% gas capture, but what that means is they're capturing 75 to 95% of the gas that's being produced at that given time. And what we see in the way that landfills are designed is that the materials are coming in, the gas systems are not fully operational depending on the design of the landfill right away. So we're seeing a lot of very putrescible things like food scraps might decay very quickly before the gas system is in place and operational. We also see that the way landfills are designed, those materials are covered. There's some initial process of where things are decaying, and then that decay stops because there's no water and there's no air getting into the landfill. And so it's just working with a group up in Wyoming. They're digging up their landfill and moving it, which is a horrible process I hope you never have to do. But what they're finding is tremendous. I mean, half-eaten carrots that look like they were buried yesterday, and newspapers that you can still read. And so we're seeing that those materials are not decaying. So we know at some point in time they will. And will the landfill gas system be operational at that point? We don't know. So we really need to be talking about what is the lifetime capture rate of the landfill methane, not just what's happening right now when the system is working optimally. And so that's where we've got some facts and figures that say over the whole lifetime of the landfill, over 30 years, 100 years, potentially 20 to 40% of that gas is going to be captured. And given that methane is so potent as a greenhouse gas, as well as a fire risk and a few other things, it's not just good enough that we capture some of it. It's really we need to be focusing on preventing the problem by not putting those materials in the landfill to start with, and by doing that, of course, capturing all the great benefits of composting as well.
And then, Adam, I have one more question for you. How did you work with the school administration to get composting into the schools?
So I wasn't involved in that, but I think Wastecap was kind of performed an audit in Louisville, and it generated some interest in that process. The superintendent of the schools, Superintendent Farber, I believe, was kind of interested in exploring a program and worked with Soil Dynamics, and I believe it's operating on a grant through the DEQ right now for the first year, and kind of see how things are going. But there was leadership from the top on that one. Obviously, if the superintendent was interested, then it's pretty easy to get it through. If somebody's lower in the on the poll, then there might be some different dynamics going on. But we were pretty lucky in this case.
And again, I believe our time has ended for the webinar. I want to thank both Kate and Adam for their time and their valuable information, and remind everyone that you will receive an email with a link to the recording of the webinar once it is online. If you have any questions, please feel free to give Wastecap or Kate or Adam a call, and I appreciate you being on the webinar today. Thank you.